So what I'm going to go over briefly what I consider to be some salient take-home messages from today. And while I do so, a couple of my graduate students are going to hand out a survey, and I would sincerely appreciate you completing that survey. You can leave it on the registration table as you leave. You don't need to put your name on it. They're meant to be anonymous. Those that know me know that I have no reservations about putting together a summary talk before the meeting even starts, because I asked these speakers here by design, and if they happen to falter and not hit the take-home points, I thought I'd just make sure that I help them along with that at the end. So in terms of novel trait development, we heard a few talks this morning about that, and what I mean by novel trait is things that are sparsely recorded relative to other traits in our genetic evaluations, things like BRD susceptibility, feed efficiency, and female fertility. And if we think about these things from an economics perspective, a 1 to 2% improvement or decrease in susceptibility to BRD has been estimated to be worth between $13 and $21 million to the U.S. cattle industry, and a 10% improvement in feed efficiency across our fed cattle sector is equal to about $1.2 billion. So that's why we're interested in these trait complexes. And they're heritable. You heard estimates today of roughly 20% heritability for susceptibility to BRD. Feed efficiency, regardless of how you define it, it's moderately heritable. And as Jared did a nice job of pointing out, we often call fertility lowly heritable and just chuck it off as something we can improve. But there's substantial genetic variation for fertility. Okay, we can make changes in this trait. You heard Larry talk about the need and efforts underway to standardize phenotypic data collection, and BIF's currently working on guidelines to do so for feed intake, BRD susceptibility, and I would point out that if we want to crossbreed adjustments for these traits, we need standard phenotypes and preferably standard underlying models to predict, but certainly we need common trait definitions to enable those kinds of things. We do have selection tools for some of these traits already. Feed intake or feed efficiency, EPDs, the majority of beef cattle breeds publish some measure of fertility, be it heifer pregnancy or stayability. So we're not completely devoid of tools to be used right now, but obviously we can do things to enhance those tools. And unfortunately, though, these selection tools or EPDs are not as pervasive as others like weight traits and carcass traits. Continued data collection is going to be absolutely critical, even with the availability of genomic predictors. To be able to develop these genomic tools, to be able to retrain them, we need phenotypes. And it was interesting, one of the favorite talks I've ever given, Mark, was in your committee at BIF in Missouri, and you asked me to talk about maybe some practical things we could do for selection for improved fertility. Probably the talk that's had the least impact that I've ever given. And the reason is because breeders looked at breed associations and said, we'd give you the data if you'll do something with it. And breed associations say, we'll do something with it if you give it to us. And so there's this kind of standoff. And the fact is, with these sparsely recorded traits, and that's why I asked Larry about the BRD question in particular, it's not going to be perfect. Not every producer is going to turn in data, but do something with it. You do something with it, it benefits those that are actually recording and turning in data, and then hopefully over time their neighbors will look over the proverbial fence and start doing it themselves. If you don't do that, you run the real risk of those progressive producers looking for an outside entity to run genetic evaluation for that trait complex. And folks, that's a bad situation when we have two different genetic evaluations for component traits that aren't run simultaneously. I think that's a very dangerous situation. We'd have to select on that which is economical, and bioeconomic selection indices are certainly the preferred method of including a lot of these things into our breeding programs. And this is already happening to some extent, again, for things like feed intake and fertility included in some of the economic indices that we have across breeds, or pardon me, within some breeds right now. So for genomic selection, I mentioned this in my talk, I think for novel traits, current USDA grants serve as a point of entry for a lot of breed associations. It's not the end game, okay? Breed associations have to take part in this themselves after the life of the grant. It goes back to that continued recording of phenotypes, continued genotyping of animals. As Mark pointed out, I think it's extremely exciting. 9+, I put plus because several breeds are on the cusp of releasing genomically enhanced EPDs. And if you think about the timeline to get to that point, we started in 09 or 10, really, with Angus starting to do it with a reduced panel, and look up where we are today in 2015. That's very encouraging. And I think that's a place where the beef cattle industry and a lot of breeders in this room should pat themselves on the back. But there still are improvements to be made in the development of training populations, the way we go about that, particularly for novel traits and corresponding prediction equations. I agree, as genotyping becomes more pervasive, that does help us dig ourselves out of this hole. However, very close colleague of mine at UNL that I've worked with since the beginning, I think would argue that just because something appears to work but is not theoretically sound doesn't mean we should be okay with it. I think we ought to tackle these kind of problems from a statistical point of view and try to alleviate them. So advancements in statistical methodology are certainly needed. This improvement opportunity, and that's what it is, this improvement opportunity should not dampen the substantial progress we've made in genomic selection. Traditional cattle evaluation has not been static. Dan, when did you guys migrate carcass data from a sire model to an animal model? Yeah. I was thinking a little bit later than that. But if you think about it, moving from a sire model to an animal model, I mean, that's an evolution. And so these things continue to evolve over time, and we have to expect that. And that's certainly not a problem. The other thing I would point out is some breeds are bigger than others, if you guys didn't know that. And in my mind, the number of genotyped animals has to be in some way proportional to the number of animals in the breed. So Angus, you've got about 160,000 animals genotyped right now. So for a much smaller breed, that 160,000 number isn't relevant. It's the number of animals in the breed, the proportion that you've genotyped, that becomes important. The nice thing that we begin to see is we're not just genotyping our favorite bulls anymore. We're beginning to genotype entire cohort groups. I think that helps alleviate some of this problem as well. When we were doing selective genotyping, the ones you guys thought could go to stud, and we didn't genotype the rest, that exacerbates this problem. To be honest, having started out with high accuracy AI sires, we did that because there's a lot more information content there. That started us off in the hole relative to training bias. Because you don't get to be high accuracy, right, if you're average across the board. You're high accuracy because you're a superstar at a few traits, probably the traits that are hallmark of the breed. Again, Dan, to pick on you, I bet a lot of high accuracy Angus bulls are pretty good in their proofs for calving ease direct and marbling, right? So we've immediately got a selected subset there. So being able, Jerry, your comment is assays get cheaper, genotyping everybody, that certainly helps. Sequencing efforts, we're hearing a lot more about that now. Several institutions, including the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, are rapidly expanding the amount of genomic data that we have. But substantial effort will be required to turn this data into information. John Pollock actually made a comment about that first thing today. There's a difference between data and information. And so we need to turn sequence data into information. A nice first step, a first tangible step towards that is the 250K assay that's coming out. To test drive and say, can we actually increase the accuracy of prediction, portability of those things across populations? So there's a lot of exciting opportunities to improve the accuracy and the portability across. In beef cattle, we generally think of populations as breeds. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for being here. Remind you that this information will be posted at some date in the future at beefefficiency.org, so encourage you to point your friends and colleagues to that resource. And then also like to point out this new website, I believe that Jared Decker made mention of it in his talk, eBEEF.org, a collaborative effort amongst several of us in beef cattle extension genetics to put information up that's germane to the beef industry and the producers. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for coming here today. I hope you realize you got to listen to some of the experts in their respective fields here in a relatively short afternoon. So again, thank you. Fill out your survey and travel safe home.